Hi, regular listeners. If you enjoy this podcast, may I point you towards another? It's hosted by one of our regular contributors, The Telegraph's China correspondent, Sophia Yan. In How to Become a Dictator, Sophia Yan and Venetia Rainey examine the life, politics, and future of the Chinese president, Xi Jinping. It's a fantastic listen, so I'd hugely recommend it to you. Thanks for listening. I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we speak to Anna Virtsan, a Kyiv native and previous guest on the podcast, about how people in the city are living through the blackouts caused by Russian drone and missile strikes. And we discuss the news and historical context that Russian troops have stolen the bones of the 18th century prince, Grigory Potemkin.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Ukraine can win, Ukraine must win, and Ukraine will win.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 28th of October, day 247. And today, I'm joined by assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, senior reporter and history correspondent Daniel Kapuro, and our guest, Anna Virtsan, who's calling us live from Kyiv. I started by asking Francis for the latest news from Ukraine.
We mentioned yesterday that we were expecting a speech from Vladimir Putin. That has now been delivered, and I will turn to that later in today's episode. But before that, I will start with news from the front lines. According to the UK Ministry of Defence, severely depleted Russian army companies in the Kherson sector have been fighting with between 6 and 8 men each when they should be formed of around 100 soldiers. In its daily update, the MOD said, quote, "In the last 6 weeks, there has been a clear move from Russian ground forces to transition to a long-term defensive posture on most areas of the front line in Ukraine. This is likely due to a more realistic assessment that the severely undermanned, poorly trained force in Ukraine is currently only capable of defence operations." That's very interesting indeed, and what we've expected and discussed in the podcast in recent times. This question particularly around the number of Russian soldiers in these units is also, I think, very interesting. As we've spoken about at length in earlier episodes, really when one looks at the Russian army in its current state, its traditional thing that it can call on throughout history is numbers, is the number of men. And we've already talked at length about the partial mobilisation, which will see more men coming, although that will take many, many months. And I think the effect of that will be negligible. But nonetheless, without these overwhelming numbers, which in its past it's been able to utilise successfully for offensive operations, what does Russia really have? It hasn't got the technical expertise. It hasn't got the effective commanders. So really, it's very, very handicapped indeed. And what we're seeing after many months now of successful Ukrainian counterattacks, counteroffensive, is a very, very severely depleted Russian army.
Thanks, Francis. There's also been some news from the US and NATO. Can you talk us through it? What does it mean?
We understand that the US will bring forward the delivery of dozens of highly accurate guided tactical nuclear weapons to Europe amid the escalating tensions with Moscow. As I say, I'll talk about Putin's speech later, which I think plays into this. So these new thermonuclear bombs are dialer yield devices, which basically means that their payload can be changed. They're expected to be sent to NATO bases within weeks. Now, before people start panicking hearing this and thinking this is something that's a huge escalation, it's not. This is something that actually was already scheduled, but it's clearly designed to reassure NATO allies amid the current saber-rattling from Russia. These replacements will begin in December. It's basically upgrading what's already there rather than it being additional deployments. Currently, the US has about 100 of these, I think, stored in bases in European countries, including Germany and Italy. So I just wanted to draw attention to that because no doubt the Kremlin's propaganda will be. But nonetheless, I think we should perhaps see this idea of it being something that's a huge development as with caution.
Thanks, Francis. Just maybe one more thing before we turn to Anna. There's been another update from from a slightly different theatre of potential conflict. That's space. Can you tell us what's happened here?
As we've touched on in the past, of course, Russia has caused lots of disputes, disagreements in this space in recent months, pulling out of the International Space Station, for instance. And there's now been an additional threat that Russia could strike Western satellites aiding Ukraine, which is drawing attention to a rather untested area of international law. And it's raising concerns amongst space lawyers who knew there was such a thing as a space lawyer, but there is, and industry executives about the safety of objects in orbit. We've spoken, of course, at length in the past about Elon Musk's use of satellites to provide internet to the front lines in Ukraine. And I think that this should be seen in this context, that the war is in many ways one that is being fought in so many different areas, technological, military, of course, the internet. But space is now also one that's being considered highly relevant to all of this. So it hasn't happened. As I say, no country has ever carried out a missile strike against an enemy's satellite. Such an act, of course, during a war in Ukraine would sharply escalate things, I think it's fair to say. But nonetheless, the fact that Russia are talking about this is, I thought, worthy of note, just as an example of the way in which this war has ramifications in areas that perhaps we haven't even considered before now.
This actually, I think, leads us on quite neatly to our next segment. So today, Ukrainian Air Force spokesman Yuri Inat said that Ukraine believes it's shot down more than 300 Iranian Shahed 136 drones so far. These are the new drones delivered, we think, by Iran over the past couple of weeks that have been causing such havoc in the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. Because, of course, even though the Ukrainians have shot down more than 300, quite a few are still getting through. And we know that blackouts have been rolling across the country and Ukrainians are having to adapt and live through that. Anna Virtsan is a friend of the podcast and a good friend as well. Anna, if you remember her from previous podcasts, showed me around Kyiv, and we did a lot of reporting together from the centre there. So thank you very much for that, Anna. It's great to have you back on. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what life is like now in Kyiv with these blackouts? How has your day been? How are you living through it?
Yeah, those last couple of weeks, I should say, was quite challenging because of our energy infrastructure is severely damaged. So for now, I think about 30% of energy infrastructure is damaged. We struggle with everyday blackouts. So what does it mean is we don't have electricity in our homes, in the streets, in the stores. It's quite hard to live in a big city without electricity, as you understand. It's even harder for those people who live in apartment blocks, fully electrified, without gas supplies. We are doing our best. We are trying to deal with it. We are warming our houses. Somebody even buying solar panels, gas panels, and to heat up, to warm up the house. We continue our everyday life. Just another challenge. This is how our day is looking. Just blackout, a lot of work, then another blackout for about 4 to up to 10 or even 14 hours a day, twice a day, and it's hard. It's hard, especially now when it's autumn and it's getting colder, especially at night, and you basically can't warm up.
And what are people doing in your block and around the place in Kyiv to support each other?
I'm quite a lucky one because I'm living in an old block and I have a gas. I have a gas supply, I have a gas stove. For example, it's easier for me to have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or just make a meal for myself. And not all my friends are so lucky, and they have to cook outside or with portable touristic gas stoves. Challenging, but yeah, we support each other morally. We try to talk more, just to openly and to manage this together as a community, because it's our common problem, and everyone is in the same position. Lots of my friends, for example, they ask for help from psychologists, but nonetheless, we totally understand that we are mourning in the big city, but meanwhile, our men and women protecting us from trenches in cold nights, and it's much harder for them than for us.
Does this feel different to your experiences in February and March when Russian troops were on the outskirts of the city? And do you think these attacks on infrastructure, I mean, I imagine the answer is no, right? But do you think these are affecting morale at all, or actually just doing even more to persuade Ukrainians that resistance and fighting is the only option?
It's a bit different, yeah, of course, because in February and especially early March, we were afraid. We were frustrated. We didn't know what to do. Lots of people left their homes behind. They fled the country. Yeah, and we had no plan to do, each of us. And this is part of our mental health, right? Stability and a chance to plan at least a week. And we didn't have that. So it was very hard. And now we are stronger. We are angry. We are not afraid at all. Even children, by the way, and we are angry and we have a plan. We are just adopting like lightning. We are strong. We are not afraid. It's challenging, yes. Annoying, oh yes.
Can I ask, sometimes these blackouts are planned, the state tells you certain hours when the electricity will be turned off, and sometimes that goes on and sometimes it's unplanned. Could you talk us through, as citizens, sort of what you receive from the state in terms of guidance?
It's quite a funny part, and we make fun of it, and we make a lot of memes about it because it should be planned, and we kind of have a schedule, and we can go to our energy company's website and check the schedule, find your street, your apartment, basically your house, and check when the blackout is planned. But it never goes according to the plan, never. It's jokes, by the way, help us to manage through this part of our day.
Well, you mentioned how people are working through this. I wondered if you give us a sense of how these blackouts are impacting your working day and your teams. How have you had to adapt around this?
I'm just a usual office worker, so my work depends on the computer and on electricity, basically. And for people like me, you have to have your computer and your batteries all charged, and you have to make sure it's always charged, so you have enough battery life for at least for a couple of hours to find another place with electricity to work, or just to have this time to work from home. I'm, for example, connecting my phone to my computer to get internet on my computer from my phone. And luckily, I have good mobile internet, and I can go on and work.
If the electricity is out in the evening, what do people do for entertainment? How do you sort of keep yourself occupied if all the lights are out and you can't get electricity through to television or computer or anything like that?
We have candles, we have LED lights. Some of us even have, as I told you before, backup generators. So people tend to play board games, read books, go for a walk, or even it's a good chance to have a proper sleep. I've talked to my friends, and we cherish this mutual mental support. And you've asked about winter and how we are going to deal with the winter. And a couple of my friends told me that girls, especially, told me that they are thinking about cutting their hair short just to save the energy in winter, not to use electric fans. Also, I know that some of my friends and their friends with kids, they put their kids to sleep in sleeping bags, in touristic sleeping bags.
How do you go about meal times if you don't know when? I mean, you said you have a gas stove, so you've got an advantage here, I imagine. But I mean, do you know from your friends and people in the block, how has this changed what they're eating and how they're preparing food? I'm quite curious about that.
We have an advantage of big city, so we have delivery. First of all, open working cafes. Cafes still keep going, keep working even without electricity as much as possible. And some people, as I told you, are thinking about getting their barbecue outside and have meal in the street, basically. So yeah, some people just buying portable gas stoves just to have a chance to warm up.
Well, thank you very much, Anna, for coming on and telling us about your life in the blackouts. Francis and Dan, do you have any questions for Anna after everything you've heard?
I have one, if that's all right. Hi, Anna. Lovely to hear your voice again on the podcast. My question is just, I suppose, a general one, really, which is how informed do you feel about what's going on in the rest of the country? I'm just interested in what the information channels are for you. I mean, I know that there's obviously Zelensky giving a speech every evening, which I imagine you'll be following in some form. But do you feel connected to what's going on in the front lines and in those regions in the south and in the east? Or does it feel very much like Kyiv is its own entity at the moment?
Oh yeah, we have a lot of information, open sources, open media, and independent media. They're working a lot. They tend to get to us, to listeners, as much as information as possible. So lots of interviews with former prisoners of war, for example, general staff from the army, from the people from liberated territories. So we have a lot of information, maybe too much sometimes, but a lot of sources. You can choose the source. So if you asking also about kind of freedom of speech, yeah, it's totally free, and we criticize our government a lot. This is, I think, this is all about us.
Thank you. If I could just come back on that, what criticisms do people make of the government?
Oh, for example, about the blackout schedules, definitely. So why it's not so fair to sit without electricity, for example, for 10 hours, like it was, and instead of 4 hours, according to schedule. So yeah, some decisions, I think like everywhere in free world, of course.
The government, the Ukrainian government, I saw warned, I think it was this week, it sort of asked refugees not to come home this year, to wait until the spring, partly because of these issues with electricity and stuff like that. Have a lot of people come back? Have you seen people come back anyway? Or is it still the case that when you're out and about, you've got loads of friends that are still abroad that are missing, that you don't see in the city anymore?
Lots of people, the major amount of people came back in spring, so in May and in June, during the summer, and I don't see that tendency of leaving or fleeing the country again. So as I know, it was only one person who told this on media, and she had a lot of critics after that, a lot. So I think it's more like her personal opinion, but it's from my side, and I don't see people thinking about fleeing.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's really, really great to hear you again. Thank you so much for sharing some of your experiences with us. Do stay around. We're going to go to Daniel Gapura now, senior reporter here and history correspondent. This is a story that Natalia Vasilyeva, a Russia correspondent, mentioned yesterday, that we believe that Russian troops have stolen the body of Grigory Potemkin, the 18th century prince. This is in Kherson. Could you tell us what's happened?
Yeah, of course. So in terms of what's happened, a little bit unclear, but it seems to be, the historian Simon Sivo Montefiore sort of raised the alarm. It seems to be that a special unit of Russian officials went to occupied Kherson, entered the St. Catherine's Cathedral, I believe it is, where Potemkin was buried, and have taken his remains, his bones, and taken them away for what they say is safe storage. They say it's not because they're expecting a Ukrainian attack, but because there's a risk of artillery strikes. Now, that's coming from the Russians, so take it with probably a large pinch of salt. But that's the argument they've made. Now, we've seen Russian efforts to suppress Ukrainian culture, to loot museums. The Ukrainian government this month, I think, put the figure at just under 40 museums where they said that items had been taken and looted and taken to Russia. And then you also have museums and galleries that have been destroyed. So you've got this broader context of the kind of the suppression of Ukrainian culture, the denial of its existence as a separate identity, as a separate culture. With Potemkin, it's possibly something slightly different going on. And he is, I think, a fascinating figure that really kind of gets into the history of Russian colonialism in this area, that in modern day Ukraine. But also the kind of slightly demented reading of history that Putin has, and that he uses to back up his invasion. So, for those who don't know, Potemkin was a favourite of the Tsarina Catherine the Great, a lover at one point. He did lots of things under her, very important official. But his leading impact, his lasting impact and legacy in the Russian speaking world was the annexation of Crimea and the wider areas around it, so sort of modern-day Kherson and Zaporizhia. From about the 12th century onwards, that area of the world was known as the Crimean Khanate. It was a Muslim, mostly Turkic state. It was sort of a vassal of the Ottomans, but roughly independent. It was the first to sort of break away from the Ottoman Empire, really. As sort of readers of history will know, the Russians and the Ottomans were longtime rivals and fought many battles, many wars. Potemkin was interesting because he was obsessed with this idea of the Greek project. So those who know about Russian history will know this concept of the Third Rome. So originally you had Rome as the centre of the Christian world, then you had Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and after that fell to the Ottomans. The Russian Empire tried to claim that Moscow had become the Third Rome, that this is where, the origins of some of the sort of early Pan-Slavism, that Moscow was the centre of the Greek Orthodox world, that anyone who was Eastern Orthodox was under the protection of Moscow, but also owed the patriarch their loyalty. And lots of Russian elites were obsessed with this idea of regaining Constantinople. Catherine the Great kind of hoped to put it under the rule of her grandson, Constantine. Potemkin was a big promoter of this, and he convinced Catherine the Great to annex Crimea, which was already, to all intents and purposes, a Russian vassal state by the late 18th century because of the sort of series of wars with the crumbling Ottoman Empire. So they annexed it. He helped create what became known as Novorossiya, which listeners will be familiar with as this kind of concept that Russian imperialists today, that Putin has, of the southern half of Ukraine somehow being Russian. He founded cities like Kherson, Sevastopol, Simferopol. But what's interesting about it is it really gets to this kind of Russian obsession with southern Ukraine and with Crimea specifically. So the importance of Crimea, as listeners probably heard before, is that the Kievan Rus, which is not Ukraine, is not Russia, it's a millennia-old state. The Kievan Rus was Christianized in the 10th century, and the symbolic moment where this happens is the conversion of Vladimir the Great, which happens in Crimea. So Crimea has always had that importance, that sort of religious symbolic importance to Orthodox Christians in the East. And it's part of why Russia has this obsession with it. But whereas Orthodox Christians from all over sort of Eastern Europe and Asia and Asia Minor would unite behind that and see that as a Slavic moment, as a moment of Christianization, Putin and Russian imperialists see it as a Russian moment, a moment, where Russia came to Christianity and kind of the beginnings, the early start of this sort of Third Rome idea. So Potemkin's kind of fascinating because he's part of that. And so this idea that the Russians have taken him, that they've taken his remains, that perhaps they'll somehow end up, Montefiore was speculating that there'll be some grand ceremony in Moscow, maybe he'll be interred there and he'll be held up again as a national hero, really kind of gets to this obsession that Putin has with Crimea and the idea of it being Russian, which denies not only 400 years of Muslim Tatar history, but then also denies what really happened in the 10th century.
Francis, I know you want to come in on this as well.
Yes, it's really interesting hearing Daniel's insights on this. I just wanted to add a more modern take on the significance of Potemkin, because he is one of those figures, to Daniel's point, that of course is in many ways the greatest minister of the Romanov dynasty in the Tsarist era in Russia. But he's also a figure that has symbolic resonance in the Soviet era too. So the battleship Potemkin was named in his honor. That's a very, very famous ship in Russia, famous for its involvement in the Russian Revolution of 1905, and its subsequent dramatization by Sergei Eisenstein, very famous Soviet filmmaker, the film is called Battleship Potemkin. And so I think it's just worth saying that there is a resonance that is not just purely Tsarist, that this name, this symbolic role transcends the Tsarist era into the Soviet one. And I think it's just another example, really, of how Putin picks and chooses from history whatever is useful for his project. He is not a Red Tsar. He is his own entity, and he will look at history through whatever means he can benefit from it. I mean, we've already talked at length about how he spoke about Peter the Great in the past. He, of course, has spoken about former communist leaders. He's tried to, in many ways, repatriate Stalin through manipulating history books in classrooms. And now we're seeing Potemkin used potentially as some kind of ideological weapon.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with everything that Francis has said there. And I think the other important thing to discuss while we're talking about Potemkin and Crimea and what was there before is obviously the role of the Crimean Tatars. So in many ways what you had there is the sort of forgotten one of because there are more than one of the forgotten genocides of this part of the world. So the Tatars, right through the sort of into the 19th century, made up about 80% of the local population in Crimea. Crimea was kind of this fascinating place throughout the early modern period. You had Venetian colonies there. If you go back to the ancient world, you had Greek colonies. The Genoese sort of stepped in later on. You had Greek populations there. And for much of that time, they were sort of concentrated on the coast and inland and on the steppes. You had various sort of nomadic peoples. But by the 18th century, really the dominant population, they'd sort of come together as a Muslim people were the Tatars, and they were this independent kingdom. And really after that, their history becomes pretty tragic. So for a long time, they were sort of a big pain really for Moscow, but also for the sort of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which ruled what is now Western Ukraine at the time. And so even beyond a lot of the other minorities that were persecuted by the Russian Empire and later by the Soviet Union, by Stalin, the Tatars really were singled out for really particularly bad treatment. So there was the deportation under Stalin. I mean, the genocide itself probably started in the 1860s under Alexander II, but it really sort of peaked with Stalin deporting up to, the estimates are hard to come by, but up to 200,000 Crimean Tatars to Uzbekistan and elsewhere. And unlike other sort of deportees, for example, in the Baltics, they weren't allowed to return until right at the end of the Soviet Union. So Gorbachev initially blocked their return to Crimea, and the law only really changed in 1989. So what you have now is just 13% of the population are Crimean Tatar, but they're an important population. They've led the resistance, a lot of the resistance post 2014 to the annexation, alongside sort of ethnic Ukrainians who remained in Crimea. The Tatars stayed there; it's their homeland. They tried to resist the Russian annexation, the Russian occupation, and they really suffered for it. So there've been reports just in the last couple of months, really, that so we know that Russia's mobilization has targeted ethnic minorities around Russia itself, because it's politically easier to keep it away from Moscow and St. Petersburg, and we've seen it concentrate in places like Dagestan. But in Crimea, there have been reports from local Tatars, from human rights organizations, that perhaps 90% of the men who are being drawn up and sent to fight are Crimean Tatars, and they're deliberately scattering them around multiple units so that they couldn't possibly get organized. Sort of the danger of giving your political enemies weapons. They wouldn't be able to rise up because the Russians know what they're doing, and they're spreading them out. But this is kind of one of these forgotten stories, perhaps, in how we see this conflict and what's going on, is that the Ukrainians and the Crimean Tatars, we shouldn't pretend that they've had the easiest relationship. They haven't always. There have long been ethnic tensions on the peninsula, but under Ukrainian rule, they were working towards building up their autonomy, working towards rebuilding what they had originally had in Crimea, and all of that was snuffed out by the annexation in 2014.
Can I just bring Anna in on this? Something when I was in Ukraine, and from speaking to lots of Ukrainians, it's really struck me is how well Ukrainians know their own history. Is this sort of thing something that's common knowledge? Where do you learn this, and how has that changed? I would ask, in your lifetime from the 90s to now, how much Ukrainians are taught about their own past, and how do they see it?
It's commonly taught in schools, so it's a part of our school program. We're studying history, like things from a very young age. And myself, for example, I was studying history in university as well, so more deeply. Then you are absolutely right. We had quite strange relationships between Ukrainians and Tatars, but it was also a part of propaganda because it's when I'm remembering like early 2000s, I was small, I was a child at the time, and I remember how the Tatars come back to Crimea, so they were deported and they were trying to come back to Crimea, to their motherland, and it was, very, very strange situation because it was a lot of aggression in media, in public. Like, what are they doing? They just taking lands without any laws. So, but now we see that it was also a part of Russian propaganda, and basically we don't have any problems with Tatars. They leave after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. For us now, it's very important to find our roots, to bring them back to light, and to teach our next generations.
Francis, I know you wanted to talk about Vladimir Putin's speech that he gave yesterday. Can you talk through some of the major points you got from it?
Certainly. Well, it was a significant speech. As I say, I think it's important to emphasise that this was scheduled. This isn't a new one. We've had some where he's, of course, made speeches off the cuff and we've all had to react accordingly, but we knew this one was coming. It was a long speech. He described the Ukrainian crisis as part of, quote, tectonic changes in the world order that have been going on for several years now. We are facing a historic milestone. Ahead of us is possibly the most dangerous, unpredictable, and at the same time crucial decade since the end of the Second World War. He then dismissed accusations that Russia would use a tactical nuclear weapon, calling it a fuss, and blamed the UK for initiating provocations. He accused the former Prime Minister of the UK, Liz Truss, of having publicly threatened Russia with a nuclear attack when she was Prime Minister. I'm not quite sure what he was referring to there, and I also find it rather strange when he was the one that first, of course, started saber-rattling and saying that they had no fear of using Satan II, which, of course, is the weapon they're developing at the moment. So quite a bizarre remark. But anyway, nonetheless, the most interesting thing about this speech is the manner in which it was designed, clearly not to appeal to a domestic audience, but to appeal to an international one. It seemed to be aimed, I would say, at winning over political conservatives, in inverted commas, abroad rather than his own citizens. Talked about Russia's battle being with Western elites. Obviously, he's trying to capitalise on the political divisions in the United States that we've talked about, also within Europe as well, whether that be countries like Italy, like France. Less so in Britain, but there is still a strand of thinking in Britain that perhaps might be seen as more pro-peace, in the sense of giving Russia territories in exchange for stability in the energy markets, for instance. And he talked about, and to just give you a sense of what he's appealing to here, he says there are at least two Wests. One West is a traditional, mainly Christian values of which the Russians feel kinship. There's another West, aggressive, cosmopolitan, crucial word there, neo-colonial, another crucial word I would say, acting as the weapon of the neoliberal, another key buzzword there, elite, and trying to impose its pretty strange values on the rest of the world. So, as I say, you hear that language and it's pitching it very, very much to a sort of populist, anti-Western elite kind of message, which no doubt will resonate with some in Europe and in the United States. I think it's unlikely that it will work, but nonetheless, I think its pitching is significant. Of course, the colonial angle is also designed to appeal to the Southern Hemisphere. And I've talked in length in the past about how Russia is trying to pitch itself as the anti-Western, anti-colonialist power alongside China. That's their central message, has been that, if you don't want to go the Western route, these former empires that once occupied you, then come with us. We'll support you financially and everything else through the Belt and Road Initiative in the China example. And just to conclude on what he was saying on that, in that speech. He ended by saying he considered President Xi to be a, quote, close friend, and said that Russia's trade with China has been rising. Now, I can imagine that in China there was a little bit of cringing around that, because they have trying, as we were speaking about at length yesterday, trying to stay out of this and being seen too closely as being Russia's key ally. But as I say, he is certainly trying to pitch this as an example in which China and Russia are still very much tied at the hip.
Thank you, Francis. I would say to all of our listeners, we did talk about this at length yesterday with our China correspondent, Sophia Yan. So if you want to hear more about Russia's relationship with China and China's relationship with Russia and what the Chinese leadership may be thinking, do listen to yesterday's episode. We are very unfortunately coming to the end of our time together today, so can I just go to our guests for your final thoughts? Dan Kapura, can I come to you first?
Of course, yeah. So spoke to Francis about this earlier, and we wanted to discuss this, which is listeners may have seen the Polish move to demolish 4 Red Army monuments scattered throughout Poland. Now, this is it does date back some time. The law behind this was actually brought in 2017, and there have been previous monuments that have been demolished in Poland, previous Red Army and Soviet monuments. But we've also seen this spreading to other countries. So in the Baltics, in particular, they've accelerated their demolition of monuments. Riga, there's a particularly large Second World War memorial that was demolished in recent weeks. Now, in Poland, there is a special case, which is that PiS, the Law and Justice, the ruling party, part of their ideology, part of their beliefs is that at the end of the Cold War, when Poland was democratized after 1989, there wasn't sufficient effort to clear out communists and former communists from the civil service, from the public sector. And this kind of feeds into this idea that a lot of these memorials are still standing. It's also important to say that there are exceptions. So memorials that are in cemeteries, for example, won't be touched. So, for example, the huge cemetery of Red Army soldiers in Warsaw won't be demolished. But it does bring up this kind of interesting and this difficult question that we faced before in previous circumstances, but is really kind of being brought to the fore by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How to deal with this history. In Poland's case, the Red Army. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers did die on Polish soil, and they were fighting Nazi Germany, but at the same time in Poland they're not associated with liberation at all. The head of the Institute of National Remembrance, Karol Nawrocki in Poland, said, this is a monument to disgrace, a monument of contempt of the winners over the victims, and said that the Soviets did not bring liberation, they brought another captivity. They were capturing Poland and treating it as booty. And it is this kind of very difficult sort of debate that has to happen, but you see a lot of across Eastern Europe. And I think that in Ukraine this will be an even harder sort of conversation to have, because how do you see the USSR there? Because it ultimately was a Russian project and a Soviet, and led to the domination of Ukraine, and you had the Holodomor and genocides, but then you also had 1.6 million Ukrainian men and women who died fighting in the Red Army. And how do you commemorate them properly without then also, celebrating the horrors of the Soviet Union? So a very difficult question that I think we'll probably come back to again and again.
Very good. Anna Virtsan, thank you so much for your time today. I'm just wondering if you'd like to sum up some of your thoughts, leave our listeners with what's on your mind as we go into the weekend.
I just want to tell you all that this is probably will be the hardest autumn and winter for Europe for the past, 70 years. And this is the time when we should show our unity and resilience and stay strong and stay together, because basically we have a common enemy. He decided to kill us as well. It's our common enemy, and we have to stay strong and to fight together.
Thank you, Anna, for all of your time today and for talking us through some of your day-to-day life in Kyiv under the blackouts. Francis Turnley, can I come to you for the very final thoughts of this week?
Thank you, David. I just wanted to draw attention to one final remark, which I thought was very interesting in Putin's speech. He said, and I'll quote it in full, "It's no coincidence that the West says that its culture should be recognised as universal. That's how they behave. And they insist through their policy that everyone accept these values unconditionally. I think this is an inversion of an argument that dictators encapsulate in some way the different values of any given society, that certain countries want to be governed by dictators because it speaks to their culture, and thus anything that is opposed to that is in some way trying to impose its values on another system. And I think that may have been true once when people weren't aware of alternatives in the age of absolute monarchs, for instance, that we were talking about earlier. But ultimately, that's not the case in the globalised world today, where you see that the idea of freedom has resonance everywhere, really, where people can see that it works, and if people weren't drawn to those values in a universal sense, you wouldn't need an FSB or a secret police to keep people in check, right? If Putin's power was rooted in the fact that people wanted him there because that's culturally what they wanted, then you wouldn't need to have these organs of state terror. So ultimately, if dictators were confident that their role encapsulates their people's culture, then why don't they feel confident enough to offer free elections? It's because I think they know the answer, that the majority of people in the modern age, when given the choice between having more freedom over their lives or less, will always be drawn to the former. That's not Western values imposing themselves. That's just human nature.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast by The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can also listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, do leave a review, as it helps others find the show. To our listeners on YouTube, for reasons beyond our control, there's sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you do want to hear an episode as soon as possible, it's available on your podcast apps. Please search for Ukraine the Latest on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred app. Check out the Ukraine page on the Telegraph website. As ever, you can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Madeline Drury, and on Twitter, Claire Hubble.